Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the October installment of the Clinical Conductor webinar series. My name is Lauren Caffarel, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I wanted to share. First, we will be providing a copy of the presentation via email within 24 hours of the webinar ending. Please be sure to check the email you used to register for the webinar. Also, we will be doing a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please submit any questions you have at any time using the GoToWebinar questions box on the right side of your screen. Today's presentation is entitled Investigator-Initiated Trials, Common Startup Struggles and Oversights, and will be presented by Liz Christensen, Senior Clinical Research Analyst at PFS Clinical. Liz is a lead clinical research analyst at PFS Clinical, a company that provides administrative solutions to meet the unique needs of research institutions. In her current role, Liz maintains a strong and detailed understanding of the clinical trial startup process, providing expertise to numerous types of healthcare institutions. Specifically, she specializes in budget development, negotiation, coverage analysis development, and coverage analysis quality assurance. Prior to joining PFS Clinical, Liz earned a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Spanish while attending the University of Wisconsin-Madison, after which she gained a diverse research background working as an operating room pharmacy technician and as a laboratory assistant at a neurological stem cell research facility. And with that, I'll hand it over to Liz.
Thank you for that introduction, Lauren. I plan to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes and then leave 15 minutes at the end for questions and comments. Within the past 2 years, investigator-initiated trials have seen a remarkable renewed interest. The additional proof of practice and clinical application data that these types of trials are providing has enabled the transition of many newly approved therapies to standard practice. The increase is in large part due to the fact that both industry sponsors and investigators are more readily recognizing these undertakings as symbiotic investments and are collaborating to utilize each other's resources. Now, research offices are doing their best to support these endeavors, but the additional administrative responsibilities involved are often unfamiliar, as they're normally taken on by industry sponsors and outside governmental agencies. Mistakes made during the initial development and startup stages are causing compliance and financial ramifications and deterring sites from this type of research. IITs aren't typically seen as the cash cows, but with this presentation, I'd like to challenge that thought and outline how, with the right administrative techniques and awareness of outside funding, we can make these studies financially efficacious. This session is meant to highlight some of the most common pitfalls and offer guidance on how to avoid them. We'll work our way through chronologically, starting with mistakes made during study conceptualization and end with those that happen around enrollment time. The specific topics I'll be covering today are protocol objective development, applying for industry sponsorship, achieving Medicare qualifying status, defining and budgeting for non-billables, and the NCT number registry requirements. Protocol objectives: interventional or observational. Oh, excuse me, got it. The first issues with IIT startup can arise during the protocol development stage. Determining whether the intent of a trial is interventional or observational, and ensuring that the protocol's objective statement accurately portrays the PI's intent is a critical preliminary step in defining your billing strategy. If the objective language insinuates that the study is interventional and purposefully assigning patients to treatment groups, then claims should be submitted following a clinical trial billing policy. If, on the other hand, the objective language implies that the trial will be conducted by simply collecting data from procedures and services performed as part of routine care outside of the trial, then we can give the study an observational status. And in that instance, nothing should be billed under the clinical trial policy. For example, in the instance of Medicare claims, if the study were to hold an observational objective rather than an interventional objective, no Q0 or Q1 modifiers should be applied to any of those patient claims. Now, in IITs, observational intent is the case more frequently than sites are recognizing. Often the PI's intent is not necessarily to assign patients to specific interventions, but rather to treat with routine care and then subsequently collect and categorize that patient data. Let's look at an example of a written objective to better understand what I mean by this. Okay, so here's the scenario. The scenario is that PIX and PIY both perform hip replacement surgeries, but PIX typically prescribes narcotic pain control for post-surgery relief, while PIY suggests your standard over-the-counter therapies. Now, they intend to collaborate on a study in order to figure out whose standard of care achieves better results and poses minimal risk. Specifically, they're interested to know whether symptoms can be relieved as effectively with the OTC therapies in an effort to minimize narcotic abuse and dependency risks. In the first example of a written objective, this may imply intervention, which is not the PI's intent here. To assess the efficacy of OTC pain control therapies versus narcotic pain control therapies in relieving post-operative pain in patients following hip replacement surgery. Once again, this objective, as written, implies that the patients are purposely assigned to treatment groups, indicating that intervention is taking place. Now, if we're to change the wording ever so slightly, so the objective now reads, to compare post-operative pain relief in patients prescribed OTC therapies to patients prescribed narcotic therapies following hip replacement surgery. With this statement, the intent would more clearly be observational. We're noting that the patient's treatments have already been determined and prescribed independently of their trial participation. Here, the PI's normal, non-research billing practices could be applied. Once this objective statement determination has been made, then we can start to formulate an appropriate financial analysis and billing procedure. The next step I'll suggest to my clients is do some gold digging. A lot of large pharma companies like Merck, Sanofi, Pfizer, and Bristol-Myers offer programs which allow them to partner with researchers from both the academic arena and community practices who are interested in conducting their own studies. They agree to offer financial support and/or drug provisions to make investigator-initiated trials possible. And their intent is to use these outside forces and perspectives to supplement their own research. Now, in order to be considered for this kind of program, study objectives should align with the sponsor's areas of interest. So, once again, precisely developed protocols with clearly written objectives are crucial to our financial analysis and financial success. So my advice here is apply early, apply often, and apply well. It's important to note, however, that in the wonderful event that your study is accepted into one of these programs and you in turn receive some kind of financial sponsorship from the pharmaceutical company, the sponsored type responsibilities, like those that I'll be addressing today, will still need to be maintained by the site, and those won't become the responsibility of the pharmaceutical company. In this slide, I've included a few links to more prominent programs. So we've got Sanofi's Investigator-Sponsored Studies Program, Pfizer's Investigator-Initiated Program, Merck's Investigator Studies Program, and Bristol-Myers Squibb's Investigator-Sponsored Research Program. Please don't let these big industry names deter you from applying. There is definitely a skewed perception of what is accepted by these programs. The criteria is pretty inclusive though, so don't hesitate to apply simply because your proposal is a phase 1 or the drug you intend to use isn't a Merck product or the study is merely data collection. For the most part, these are not disqualifiers. They're looking for novel ideas that haven't been thought of internally. So they're looking for good science that's clinically applicable. Also, response time is not insane either. I've reached out to Pfizer specifically, and they promise a response within 45 days of their receipt of your proposal. So not immediate, but not terrible. The next issue our clients have quite often is achieving Medicare qualifying status for their IITs. This qualifying status allows the sites to bill for trial procedures under Medicare's clinical trial policy, NCD 310.1, and potentially receive more comprehensive reimbursement. Study drug administration fees and items performed to prevent and treat study drug side effects are also eligible for payment under this policy. Now, in order to achieve qualifying status, a trial must either financially be supported by an approved governmental agency, for example, the NIH or Center for Disease Control, and this is rarely the case with IITs, or it must be approved for an IND number or an IND exemption. And oftentimes, investigators are not aware that they will need to apply for an IND number or an exemption, and they are unpleasantly surprised when Medicare refuses to pay for certain items, or their institution is reprimanded for failure to comply with the clinical trial billing policy. The take-home message here is that we strongly recommend that research office administrators educate their PIs often and early about IND submission procedures in order to avoid those financial pitfalls down the road. Once these preliminary status determinations have been made, so interventional versus observational, and qualifying versus non-qualifying, then it's time to really assess the financial impact of the study on the research department funds. The feedback I hear regularly comes from very confused PIs when they see money being pulled from their grant funds for the study's non-billable items. Usually something along the lines of, but I order this all the time in my practice. This is where I would strongly recommend a financial analysis happen in a two-step sequence. First, an explanatory coverage analysis should be built beforehand to both predict the research fund expenses, and additionally, this is why I say explanatory, to provide a thorough explanation to the PI and his staff as to why certain services can't be billed. The per-patient research expenses can be identified by Medicare's National Coverage Determinations, NCDs, and local contractor coverage determinations, LCDs, that limit billing for certain CPT codes, and additionally by consent form language that promises services free to the patient. Step 2 of this financial analysis would involve totaling these research expenses through an internal budget build. Now, outside of a trial, non-billable items typically become the patient's responsibility. And the PIs are rarely aware of these denials. But when billing through trial policy, the funds for those non-billable services come out of the research kitty. And then the PIs are forced to recognize. This budget that we're building can then be used to answer the questions, what are my total costs to the research department? And ultimately, is this study financially feasible? The final oversight I see is in the last steps of study startup, right before patient enrollment. Sites are often unaware of the fact that they, as the trial sponsors now, are responsible for registering the study with the federal government in order to obtain an NCT identifier number. Now, this is a likely oversight, seeing that for industry-sponsored studies, this is always taken care of by the pharmaceutical or device company. And in cooperative studies, this is taken care of by outside governmental agencies. This is a really important compliance step because in order to bill trial services and procedures appropriately and compliantly to Medicare, this identifier should be included on all the patient claims. Many times, sites only become aware of this requirement to register once they receive claim denials or are confronted by CMS for failure to comply with the clinical trial billing policy. Details for how to register can be found on clinicaltrials.gov, and I've included that link here. Now, the actual registration process is fairly simple, but sites should be aware that according to Section 801 of the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act, this should be done within 21 days of enrollment of the first participant. So that rounds out all of our highlights for today. Now, emphasizing these common pitfalls is in no way meant to deter participation. In fact, with proper budgeting and billing, IITs have the potential to be incredibly rewarding. Industry sponsors have been looking to partner with sites that are present in the IIT sector in order to appear transparent with their intent and also to increase product exposure to prescribers. So establishing your site as an IIT powerhouse can be incredibly lucrative and can be a great marketing strategy to promote those industry trial opportunities down the road. IITs are also a fantastic way for administrators to show support for their PI's initiatives and interests and to support the incorporation of novel therapies into standard daily practices. But reward can only come about if there is a solid understanding of the administrative processes that are required to take on these studies. So that is all that I have for you. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope that this session has provided some beneficial insights. Please feel free to submit questions now if you haven't already done so. And with the time remaining, I'll answer as many as I possibly can. After the session, if you have further questions, please feel free to contact me via phone or email with the information that I've provided on this slide.
Thanks, Liz, for that excellent presentation. Now we will move into the question and answer portion of the presentation. All right, our first question is, what are some major differences between the clinical trial billing policy and the non-research billing policy?
Great. Okay. So when formulating a clinical trial billing policy, I think it's really important to appreciate both Medicare's requirements as well as your institution's internal preferences, as long as those aren't contradictory. That being said, I think I can only speak to the Medicare specifics. So under their policy, the main differences would be that non-research billing should not utilize NCD 310.1 to justify billing an item to insurance. As we touched on earlier, NCD 310.1 is Medicare's trial policy. First, it allows providers to bill for tests and exams that are done to monitor and treat side effects of the investigational drug, even if it's not normally done for patients with that indication. For instance, a study might be enrolling patients with breast cancer, and the protocol calls for amylase lab testing. Now, based on the guidelines and based on the PI's normal practice, you wouldn't perform this test. But the study drug has some notable pancreatic side effects that we need to monitor for patient safety. We can justify billing the amylase labs to Medicare by referencing NCD 310.1, the research billing policy. The same justification holds true for study drug administration fees as well. When billing through research policy, we can justify billing administration fees for the study drug, even if this wouldn't be a cost for a patient under normal care. So that's major difference number one. Major difference number two in Medicare's eyes between the research billing and non-research billing is the application of claims modifiers. When we're billing for research items, we'll need to include a Q1 modifier on all of the items billed to insurance within our study parameters. The reason being is that this is how Medicare tracks their trial-related fees for their own internal statistical analysis. So if we don't include this modifier on our claims, we're in line to get claims denials or a slap on the wrist of some kind.
All right, great. Our next question is, Do PI-initiated studies require that the PI maintain delegation logs, 1572 type documents, or adverse event logs?
Can you repeat that one more time, Lauren?
Sure. Do PI-initiated studies require that the PI maintain delegation logs, 1572 type documents, or adverse event logs?
Based on my knowledge, I would say yes. I can't answer that one with 100% confidence. Whomever's question that was, please feel free to email that to me, and I can answer that with 100% confidence via email. And also to that point, if anyone else, if that was not your particular question, but anyone else is specifically interested in that answer, once again, please feel free to email me, and I can disperse those answers where necessary.
All right. Our next question is, do you have any tips on how to negotiate milestone payments with industry-funded IITs?
So I think that has to do with looking at your internal budget and really understanding what fees are important to your institution. Now, if we're looking at milestones, those are going to be more visit total type things. And at the end of the day, perhaps moving items out into invoiceables or bumping up things like overhead in order to compensate and redistribute those costs is probably the best route to go.
All right, great. Next question is, how would you view comparative effectiveness studies in billing? Should it be written as an observational study, or can you carve out portions that are specifically research?
One more time, Lauren.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right.
How would you view comparative effectiveness studies in billing? Should it be written as an observational study, or can you carve out portions that are specifically research?
So I think we have to look at the study as a whole, and this really goes back to the intent of the objective, and perhaps consulting with your PI and saying, what is your true stance? What are we looking at from your standpoint? Because I don't think that it's appropriate to try to make a study an observational study unless that's their true intent. And if there's really no way to mark out some items as interventional and then split the study and say some items are observational. We really have to look at the study as a whole. So I would suggest consulting with your PI to really understand what the intent of his question is, and then moving forward from there.
All right. Next question. For industry-sponsored studies, the sponsor can meet with the FDA for protocol development. Does the FDA also meet with investigators for investigator-initiated research?
That's also a great question that I'm not sure I can answer right off the top of my head. I know there are people here that I can consult with. So once again, if that's your question, or if you are interested in knowing the response to that question, please, please, please send me an email and we will get back to you.
All right. Next question. What happens if based on the PI's intent and objective language, we determine the study is interventional, but we can't achieve qualifying status for some reason. How should we bill?
Well, the most common approach that we see for non-qualifying studies is to still consider items and services that would be provided outside of the study to be billable during the study. In this circumstance, we would utilize the non-research billing tactics and not include those trial modifiers, our claims to Medicare. And the basic reasoning for this stance is that Medicare's guidelines limit coverage for non-qualifying studies. Rather, their research billing guidelines from NCD 310.1 clarify and expand coverage for some of those additional items that we talked about. So billing determinations here could be based off clinical care guidelines and PI's general practice, and those additional side effect related tests and study drug administration costs should not be billed.
Okay. If evaluating the use of a minimal risk device in a population and for an indication not FDA approved, can follow-up procedures based on findings from that device be performed standard of care? What if these follow-up procedures will also be analyzed to answer the research question?
So I think this comes back to what I was addressing with that previous question. We really need to upfront determine what our study parameters are. What is the starting point of our study and what is the end point of our study? And here at PFS, we like to build those coverage analysis grids. And so we can clearly demarcate when study start happens and what our final follow-up visit is that's associated with that study. And then anything that falls within those parameters really should be considered part of the study and not done as SOC outside of the trial. If we've determined within the trial that it's standard of care based on those clinical care guidelines and the PI's personal practice, then that's fine. We can bill those items, but we'll need to do that through the research billing policy. If we're doing that outside of the study parameters, then that's fine to bill that item as an SOC item if it's under the clinical care guidelines and the PI's general practice, but then we won't be including those Q1 modifiers on that claim.
All right. Next question. What are some key words that distinguish between interventional versus observational when writing the objective statement?
I think the key word in the example that I gave before is prescribed. Using the past tense to note that it was done prior to and outside of the trial is key. And also, prescribed versus terminology like assigned, important as well. Prescribed implies that a medical decision was made based on individual assessment, and it's truly a patient-specific determination, not one that was determined by an IVRS or an IWRS. I can't think of a scenario in which words like randomized or assigned would lead to an observational status. That being said, I'm sure there are PIs out there that can come up with some pretty fancy phrases. So if you have any specific language you'd like feedback on, I'm more than happy to take a look. So once again, please feel free to email me at the address that is on this last slide here, and we can take it from there.
All right, great. Another question. We've gone recently from predominantly sponsored projects in our portfolio to nearly 50 to 70% of our portfolio anticipated to be IIT projects. We are struggling with supporting and facilitating this influx in terms of compliance, regulatory and project development internally, areas typically wrapped up nicely for us by the sponsors. How do you suggest making this transition, and what resources are you aware of that might help us?
Well, first of all, that is quite the transition. I would say I can understand that it's probably a financial hit, seeing as industry-sponsored trials are, typically the cash cows. So that being said, I would definitely recommend educating your PIs about these industry sponsorships for your IIT studies, and in that sense, perhaps getting some cash flow to support these endeavors would be number one. Also, I think reaching out to those industry-sponsored programs can provide a really great avenue for communication and insight as to how to finalize studies and things of that nature, more of the administrative tasks. And I guess the other suggestion is outsourcing it for those beginning phases. Outsourcing to, might seem like a marketing tool for PFS, but sincerely, outsourcing to companies that really see these studies every day and have that expertise in order to get you through those initial bumps and to educate your internal staff. It doesn't need to be an extensively long period of time. It definitely tends to end up that way because people become really familiar with PFS and they truly appreciate our services, and it takes a great workload off of their plate. But just learning from our expertise is beneficial in itself, just being able to train your staff in that sense. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to industry sponsors in order to apply for those financial grants or financial support, and then reaching out to companies such as ourselves in order to get that expertise where needed and train your staff as appropriately.
All right, I think we've come to our last question. It has come up a couple of times at my institution that a patient can't enroll in a trial due to eligibility criteria, but the PI still thinks this drug may be their best option. I am unsure of how to pursue an expanded access type trial. Can you offer some insight?
Sure. First, I would search clinicaltrials.gov using the NCT number of the original study that the patient was not eligible for. And On that site, there should be a note in the status section letting you know whether or not this drug is available for expanded access use. So the Department of Health and Human Services issued a memo about a month back, I think, requiring the manufacturer of investigational drugs to submit notice of this to the FDA so that this information can be made public and institutions like yours will be aware if this is a feasible option. Second, if expanded access is feasible, you'll also need to submit a letter of authorization to the industry manufacturer asking for permission to use their product for your expanded access scenario. The person to reach out to specifically would probably be the regulatory affairs official of that company. And then additionally, your PI needs to submit to the FDA an individual patient expanded access IND request. This IND number will then allow your study to have qualifying trial status with Medicare. So in my mind, those are the big first steps.
All right, great. So that wraps up our Q&A for today. Just a reminder that the slides will be sent out via email within 24 hours after today's presentation. Thank you everyone for attending the presentation, and we hope that you found it interesting and informative. A big thanks to Liz for presenting, and be sure to be on the lookout for the next installment of the Clinical Conductor webinar series.